Hi, I'm Emma, and when my stepmother Victoria called me a beggar in front of the entire Pinehurst Country Club dining room, she had no idea I was about to reveal something that would make her face turn white. The valet had just asked me about renewing my legacy membership, and Victoria's confident smirk dissolved into pure horror when she realized what those words actually meant. They had spent 18 months treating me like charity, erasing me from family events, whispering about my financial struggles while I smiled and stayed silent. But what they didn't know was that 6 months ago, I became worth more than their entire social circle combined. The room didn't just go quiet when the truth came out, it went dead silent, and suddenly everyone was looking at Victoria like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Pinehurst Country Club's main dining room, casting long shadows across tables where Westchester County's most prominent families gathered for their weekly social rituals. I had arrived exactly on time for what Victoria called a family celebration, though I suspected the only thing being celebrated was another opportunity to remind me of my place in their new hierarchy. The valet parking attendant, a middle-aged man with kind eyes named Marcus, had greeted me with unexpected familiarity when I pulled up in my modest Honda Civic between the Bentleys and Mercedes that dominated the lot. "Miss Richardson," he had said, his voice carrying a warmth that caught me off guard. "Good to see you back. We've missed you around here. Will you be renewing your membership this quarter, or would you prefer to handle it through the main office like your mother used to?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and confusing. I mumbled something non-committal about checking with family first, handed him my keys, and walked toward the club's imposing entrance. The Georgian architecture hadn't changed since my childhood visits with Mom, but everything else felt different now. The doorman, who used to ruffle my hair when I was 12, looked through me as if I were invisible. The hostess, who once saved me extra dinner rolls, now checked her list twice before reluctantly admitting I belonged. Inside, the dining room buzzed with the particular energy of people who had never worried about money discussing those who did. Crystal glasses caught the light like prisms, silverware gleamed against pristine white tablecloths, and conversations flowed in that careful cadence of the comfortably wealthy. I spotted my family's table immediately. Victoria sat at the center like a queen holding court, her perfectly styled auburn hair catching the light as she gestured animatedly to the women surrounding her. My father Robert looked smaller somehow, diminished in his expensive suit, nodding along to conversations where he once would have led. Victoria's daughter Madison slouched in her chair with the bored expression of a teenager forced to attend adult functions, scrolling through her phone with practiced indifference. Next to her sat Stephanie Walsh, Victoria's closest ally in what had become an 18-month campaign to reshape our family's social landscape. Stephanie's husband Trevor completed the circle, his presence lending the gathering the gravitas that came with his position on the club's board of directors. As I approached the table, I could hear fragments of their conversation drifting above the ambient noise of clinking silverware and polite laughter. Victoria's voice carried furthest, as it always did when she was performing for an audience. "The charity committee appointment is such an honor," she was saying, her manicured hand resting on a thick folder of what I assumed were event planning documents. "Stephanie and I have been working on the spring gala for months. The theme is New Beginnings, which feels so appropriate for our family." I reached the edge of their conversational circle and stood there for a moment waiting for acknowledgement that never came. My father glanced up briefly, offered a distracted smile, then returned his attention to his wine glass. Victoria continued speaking as if I hadn't arrived, though I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was very aware of my presence. "Emma?" Madison said without looking up from her phone, "You're blocking my light." The comment drew attention to my arrival in the way that teenage rudeness sometimes does, cutting through adult pretense with uncomfortable honesty. Victoria's head turned toward me with deliberate slowness, her expression shifting into what I had learned to recognize as her public face, all warmth and concern with edges sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, there you are," she said, her voice carrying the kind of false brightness people use when they're disappointed but trying to hide it. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd changed your mind about joining us." I checked my phone quickly. I was exactly on time, which meant this was another small test I had apparently failed. In Victoria's world, being precisely punctual suggested you had nowhere more important to be, while being fashionably late indicated a full social calendar and high demand. These were the kinds of social mathematics I had never learned to calculate, growing up in a family where showing up when you said you would was considered basic respect. "Sorry if I kept you waiting," I said, though I knew I hadn't. Traffic was lighter than expected. Stephanie leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering helpful advice. "You know, dear, if you plan to arrive about 15 minutes after the reservation time, you'd find the timing works much better. That's how we all do it." The gentle correction stung precisely because it was delivered with such apparent kindness. This was how exclusion worked in places like Pinehurst, not through direct cruelty, but through 1,000 small suggestions that you didn't quite understand the rules everyone else had memorized. A server appeared beside our table, young and efficiently invisible in the way that service staff learn to be in establishments like this. He began distributing menus with practiced precision, placing the leather-bound folders at each place setting. When he reached my spot, he hesitated slightly, glanced toward Victoria, then continued with his task. "Actually," Victoria said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by neighboring tables, "I don't think we'll need a menu there. Emma won't be dining with us today." The server's hand froze halfway to my place setting. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from anger but from the particular shame that comes when you're being managed publicly by someone who's supposed to care about you. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice level despite the tremor I could feel building in my chest. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Well, sweetheart, this is actually a members' event. The Spring Gala Planning Committee. Since you're not involved in the charity work, I thought you might prefer to wait in the lobby. There's a lovely seating area near the windows." The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with such matter-of-fact pleasantness. Victoria had just excluded me from a family meal, and made it sound like she was doing me a favor. My father said nothing, studying his wineglass as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "I see," I managed, proud that my
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
voice remained steady. "I must have misunderstood when you said this was a family celebration." "Oh, it is," Stephanie chimed in helpfully. "It's just that family can mean so many different things these days, can't it? Victoria's been telling us about all the changes since she joined the Richardson family. How wonderful that Robert found someone who understands the social responsibilities that come with membership here." The implication hung heavy in the air. Victoria understood these responsibilities. I apparently did not. Trevor nodded sagely, as if witnessing a lesson being taught rather than a person being humiliated. "The Spring Gala is going to raise over $200,000 for children's literacy programs," Victoria continued, her voice gaining enthusiasm as she moved into safer territory. "It's such important work. Of course, it requires a certain level of commitment and understanding of how these events function. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of social coordination." Madison finally looked up from her phone, her teenage radar apparently detecting drama worth observing. "Mom's right," she said with the casual cruelty that only adolescents can master. "Some people just aren't charity gala people. There's nothing wrong with that." The server still stood frozen beside our table, menu in hand, clearly uncomfortable with the social dynamics playing out before him. I made the decision for everyone by stepping back slightly, creating physical distance that matched the emotional chasm that had just opened beneath my feet. "You know what? I said, manufacturing a smile that felt like broken glass in my mouth. I actually have some calls to make anyway. Please, don't let me interrupt your planning. As I turned to leave, I heard Victoria's voice behind me, pitched to carry just far enough. She's always been sensitive about these things. It's understandable, really. After Grace died, Emma never quite figured out how to navigate social situations on her own. We're trying to help her, but you can't force someone to engage if they're not ready. The words followed me across the dining room like smoke, clinging to my clothes and hair, marking me as someone to be pitied rather than respected. Other diners glanced up as I passed, their expressions shifting from curiosity to that particular mix of embarrassment and fascination people display when witnessing someone else's social downfall. I made it to the lobby before the tears threatened, finding refuge in one of the leather armchairs Victoria had so thoughtfully suggested. The space was elegant and empty, decorated with oil paintings of the club's founding members and golf tournament winners from decades past. Through the tall windows, I could see the 18th hole where my mother had taught me to play golf on summer mornings, when the dew still clung to the grass, and the world felt full of possibilities. That's when Marcus appeared, apparently having finished with the afternoon's valet duties. He approached with the same careful respect he had shown outside, but now his expression carried something that looked like concern. "Miss Richardson," he said quietly, glancing toward the dining room to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with your membership status? I've been here 15 years, and I remember when you and your mother used to come regularly. Your name hasn't appeared on any of the recent renewal notices, and I wanted to make sure there wasn't some administrative error." The question confused me more than Victoria's casual cruelty had. "I'm sorry, what renewal notices?" Marcus's eyebrows drew together in a way that suggested he was beginning to understand something I didn't. "The quarterly membership renewals. Legacy members like yourself usually handle them in March, June, September, and December. We're coming up on the September deadline, and the office mentioned they hadn't heard from you. I thought perhaps you'd been traveling or dealing with family matters." "Legacy members like myself," I repeated slowly, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Marcus, I think there might be some confusion. I'm not a member here. I come as my father's guest sometimes." The expression that crossed Marcus's face was one I would remember for the rest of my life. It started as confusion, shifted through surprise, and settled into something that looked like anger on my behalf. "Miss Richardson," he said very quietly, "you've been a legacy member of this club since your 21st birthday. Your mother established the membership as part of your inheritance, same as she did for herself when her father passed. The Richardson family has held founding member status since 1952. Your membership doesn't depend on your father's, and it certainly doesn't require anyone's permission to activate." The words crashed over me like cold water, washing away 18 months of confusion and self-doubt in a single moment of clarity. I sat in that leather chair, staring at this kind man who had just handed me a truth that changed everything, and felt something shift deep in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something much more dangerous. Understanding. "Marcus," I said slowly, "would you mind showing me where I might find the membership records?" 20 minutes later, I sat in the club's administrative office with Mrs. Helen Garrett, the membership coordinator who had known my family since before I was born. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same efficient bun she had worn throughout my childhood, and her reading glasses perched on her nose as she spread documents across her desk with the precision of someone who had spent decades organizing other people's important papers. "I have to say, Emma, I was surprised when the renewal notices came back marked return to sender from your old address," she said, her voice carrying the gentle reproach of someone who had expected better. "When your mother passed, we sent everything to your father's house as a courtesy, assuming you'd want to handle the transition together as a family." She handed me a thick folder labeled Richardson, Emma Legacy Member #0847, and watched as I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were documents that painted a picture of a life I hadn't known I was living. Membership certificates, correspondence about club policies, invitations to member-only events, voting ballots for board elections, and financial statements showing quarterly dues automatically deducted from an account I had forgotten existed. Your mother set up everything very carefully, Mrs. Garrett continued, pulling out a letter written in my mother's familiar handwriting. She wanted to ensure your membership was completely independent of any family considerations. Legacy status means you have full voting rights, committee appointment privileges, and sponsorship capabilities. You're actually eligible to serve on the board yourself if you're ever interested. I stared at the papers in my hands, trying to process what this meant. For 18 months, Victoria had been positioning herself as my guide to social acceptability, suggesting that my presence at club functions was conditional on her goodwill and my father's generosity. She had made me feel like a charity case, someone who needed to earn the right to exist in spaces that had been mine by birthright since childhood. Mrs. Garrett, I said carefully, what level of membership does my stepmother hold? The older woman's expression became diplomatically neutral in the way that spoke volumes. Mrs. Victoria Richardson holds a spouse member status through her marriage to your father. It's a lovely membership level that provides access to most club facilities and social events, but not voting rights. No dear, spouse members cannot vote in club elections or serve on committees unless specifically appointed by a legacy member sponsor. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Victoria's desperate need to control family narratives, her insistence on managing social invitations, her careful positioning of herself as the Richardson family's social coordinator, it all made sense now. She had been trying to claim authority she didn't actually possess, using my ignorance of my own status to elevate her position within the club's hierarchy. I thought about every family gathering where I had been subtly excluded, every invitation that had mysteriously never reached me, every conversation where Victoria had spoken for our family as if she were its only qualified representative. She hadn't been protecting me from social obligations I couldn't handle, she had been protecting herself from a competition she couldn't win. Mrs. Garrett, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months, I'd like to update my contact information and ensure all future correspondence comes directly to me. Also, I believe I need to catch up on some committee appointments and club business I may have missed. The smile that spread across her face was warmer than sunshine. Oh, Emma, it would be wonderful to have you active in club affairs again. Your mother was such a dedicated member, and we've missed the Richardson family's involvement in our activities. Let me get the current committee roster and see where your interests might align. As she bustled around the office gathering papers, I sat back in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. Not happiness, exactly, but a sense of belonging that didn't require anyone else's permission or approval. I was Emma Richardson, legacy member #0847, granddaughter of founding member Thomas Richardson, daughter of Grace Richardson, who had served on 5 committees and donated countless hours to club improvements. I wasn't the charity case Victoria had painted me as, I was the legacy she had been trying to overshadow. The walk back to the dining room felt different this time. My steps were steadier, my shoulders straighter, and when other members nodded politely as I passed, I realized they weren't being condescending. They were showing the respect due to someone whose family name was carved in marble in the club's founding members' memorial hall. I approached our table just as Victoria was regaling her audience with another story about social coordination challenges. She looked up as I arrived, and I saw the moment she registered something different in my posture, my expression, the way I no longer seemed to be apologizing for taking up space. "Back so soon, dear?" she asked, her voice maintaining its practiced sweetness but with an undercurrent of wariness. "I hope you were able to make your calls." "Actually," I said, settling into the chair the server quickly provided, "I was handling some club business with Mrs. Garrett, catching up on correspondence I'd missed and discussing committee appointments for the fall season." Stephanie tilted her head with polite confusion. "Committee appointments? I wasn't aware you were involved in club activities, Emma." "Oh yes," I replied, accepting the menu the server offered with a gracious smile. "I've been a legacy member since I turned 21, though I've been rather inactive since Mom passed. Mrs. Garrett was just updating me on some opportunities to get more involved." The silence that followed was beautiful in its completeness. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, Trevor's eyebrows rose toward his hairline, and Stephanie looked back and forth between Victoria and me as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly revealed new pieces. Legacy member. Victoria's voice was carefully controlled, but I caught the slight tremor that suggested her world had just shifted beneath her feet. Founding family privilege, I explained casually, as if discussing the weather. My great-grandfather was one of the original members who established the club in 1952. Mom made sure I inherited the membership when I came of age. I'm actually eligible for board appointments and committee leadership roles, which is exciting since I've been looking for ways to get more involved in charitable work. Madison looked up from her phone for the second time that afternoon, her teenage radar apparently detecting seismic shifts in family power dynamics. My father, who had been silent throughout Victoria's earlier performance, suddenly seemed very interested in his salad. "That's wonderful," Stephanie managed, though her voice suggested she was rapidly recalculating social equations that had suddenly become more complex. "I had no idea you were already established here at the club." Trevor, with the businessman's instinct for shifting alliances, leaned forward with renewed interest. "Emma, you should definitely consider getting involved with the facilities committee. We're always looking for fresh perspectives, especially from the founding families." I watched Victoria's face as the conversation continued around her, saw the moment she realized that her careful architecture of social exclusion had just collapsed. In trying to diminish my status, she had revealed her own limitations. Her spouse membership, which had seemed so significant when compared to my apparent lack of belonging, now looked exactly like what it was: derivative authority that depended entirely on someone else's position. The server returned to take our orders, and this time no one suggested I might prefer to wait in the lobby. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself genuinely enjoying conversations about club activities, charitable initiatives, and social events that I was not just invited to observe but qualified to help lead. When Victoria excused herself for the ladies' room, I knew she was really going somewhere private to make phone calls, probably to her friends, possibly to people who might help her understand how badly she had miscalculated the afternoon's dynamics. I sat in that dining room, surrounded by crystal and silver, and the comfortable chatter of people who had never questioned their right to occupy space, and realized that for the first time in 18 months, I belonged somewhere without having to earn it, justify it, or apologize for it. But even as I smiled and participated in discussions about fall fundraising events and holiday party planning, a part of my mind was already working on a different level. Victoria had spent 18 months systematically excluding me from family decisions, social events, and important conversations. She had done it carefully, subtly, always with plausible explanations and apparent concern for my well-being. What else had she been managing without my knowledge? What other aspects of my life had been filtered through her interpretation of what was appropriate, necessary, or within my capabilities? As the afternoon wound down and we prepared to leave, Marcus appeared beside our table with the same discreet professionalism he had shown all day. "Miss Richardson," he said, "your car is ready whenever you'd like to leave. Also, Mrs. Garrett asked me to give you this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in careful script. "Information about next week's Legacy members' meeting, I believe." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure as we said our goodbyes, and made plans for future gatherings that I was now apparently expected to attend. As we walked toward the Valet station, I could feel her calculating, trying to find a way to regain control of a narrative that had slipped entirely out of her hands. In the parking lot, as Marcus held my car door open, he leaned down slightly and said quietly, "Your mother would be proud, Miss Richardson. She always said you had more strength than you knew." Driving home through the tree-lined streets of Westchester, I thought about strength and power, and the difference between them. Victoria had power, social connections, financial resources through her marriage, and the confidence that came from understanding complex social rules. But strength was different. Strength was what allowed you to sit quietly, while someone dismissed your worth, knowing that their words couldn't change the fundamental truth of who you were. I had been strong for 18 months without even knowing it. Now it was time to learn how to use that strength strategically, because Victoria's performance that afternoon had revealed something important. She wasn't just managing my social life out of concern or conviction. She was actively working to diminish my position within our family and our community. That night, I sat in my Manhattan apartment with my mother's jewelry box open on the dining table, looking through documents and letters I hadn't touched since the funeral. Hidden beneath insurance policies and tax forms, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in Mom's handwriting, "For Emma, when she's ready to remember who she is." Inside was a letter that would change everything I thought I knew about my inheritance, my family, and the 18 months of careful manipulation that had convinced me I was grateful for scraps from a table that had always been mine. The letter from my mother felt like holding lightning in my hands. Her familiar handwriting covered 3 pages of cream-colored stationery, the same kind she had used for thank you notes and birthday cards throughout my childhood. But this wasn't a casual message. Every word had been chosen with surgical precision, as if she had known exactly what battles I would be fighting, and had prepared ammunition accordingly. "My dearest Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then 18 months have passed since my funeral, and I suspect you're beginning to see the cracks in the foundation I tried so hard to build for you. Victoria is brilliant, charming, and absolutely ruthless when it comes to protecting what she perceives as her territory. I married your father when he was vulnerable and grieving, and she will use that same vulnerability to reshape our family's legacy in ways that serve her vision rather than honoring what we built together." The words hit like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were devastatingly accurate. Mom had seen it coming, had understood Victoria's strategy before I even recognized there was a war being fought. She had watched my father's second courtship with the analytical eye of someone who understood that love and manipulation often wore identical masks. "You need to understand something about your inheritance that we never had time to discuss properly. The Richardson Holdings Trust that your grandfather established wasn't just about money, though there is substantial money involved. It was about ensuring that our family's values and priorities would survive generational changes. The trust requires unanimous consent from all Richardson heirs for any major financial decisions. That includes you, darling. It has always included you." I set the letter down on my kitchen table and stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline, trying to process what this meant. For 18 months, I had watched my father make increasingly expensive decisions. The European vacation with Victoria's extended family, the renovation of their Hamptons house, the purchase of Victoria's daughter's car, the private school tuition that had appeared on family financial statements without discussion. I had assumed these were decisions he was making independently, using his portion of Mom's life insurance and his own business income. But if Mom was right, if the trust required my consent for major expenditures, then either my father had been violating the terms of our family's financial structure, or someone had been signing documents on my behalf. The thought made my hand shake as I picked up the letter again. "Victoria will try to convince you that you're not equipped to handle these responsibilities. She will frame your inexperience with wealth management as evidence that you need guidance, protection, even control. Don't believe her. The Richardson family has thrived for 3 generations because we taught our children to think independently, act ethically, and never apologize for taking up space in rooms where we belong. You belong everywhere, Emma. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." The final page contains specific instructions about documents I should locate, attorneys I should contact, and financial institutions where accounts had been established in my name years before I was old enough to understand their significance. At the bottom, in handwriting that looked slightly shakier than the rest, Mom had added a postscript that made my breath catch in my throat. "If Victoria has been managing communications with Meridian Trust Bank, you need to know that she has no legal authority to represent your interests. Any documents bearing your signature that you didn't personally sign constitute fraud. I pray I'm wrong about her intentions, but my instincts about people have rarely failed me. Protect yourself, darling. And remember that being kind doesn't require being weak." I spent the next 3 hours on my laptop, searching through email accounts I rarely checked, and finding evidence that confirmed my mother's worst fears. Dozens of messages from Meridian Trust Bank, all forwarded to an email address I didn't recognize. Investment statements showing account activity I had never authorized, transfer notifications for sums that made my head spin, and threaded throughout it all, a digital paper trail that painted a picture of financial coordination I had never been part of. The most damning evidence came from a document that had been scanned and emailed to me 6 months earlier. My signature on a power of attorney form that granted Victoria Richardson limited authority to handle Richardson Holdings business on my behalf. The signature looked perfect, identical to my usual handwriting, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. It was dated from a weekend when I had been in California at a tech conference, 3 time zones away from any notary who could have witnessed my signature. I called the law firm that had handled my mother's estate, requesting an appointment with the senior partner who had known our family for decades. James Morrison had silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted about its cost. His office overlooked Central Park, and I found myself staring at the trees while he reviewed documents I had brought in a manila folder that felt heavier than it should have. "Emma," he said finally, removing his reading glasses and setting them carefully on his mahogany desk, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me a direct answer. Did you sign this power of attorney document?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I was in San Francisco that weekend, speaking at a cybersecurity conference. I have plane tickets, hotel receipts, and about 300 people who can verify I was there." James nodded grimly, making notes on a legal pad with handwriting that looked like controlled chaos. "I was afraid you might say that. Your stepmother contacted me about 6 months ago, claiming that you had asked her to help coordinate some family financial matters because you were overwhelmed by the complexity of your inheritance. She seemed very knowledgeable about the trust structure and had copies of documents that appeared to be in order. What kind of coordination?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. "Primarily investment relocation and some restructuring of the quarterly distributions. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger my concern at the time, but in hindsight, I should have insisted on speaking with you directly before processing any of the paperwork." James spread several documents across his desk, each one showing transactions that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money moved from conservative investments into riskier ventures. Funds shifted from accounts that generated steady income into projects that might or might not pay off. Resources redirected from educational trusts that would have benefited multiple family members into initiatives that seemed designed to benefit primarily Victoria's social ambitions and her daughter's expensive preferences. "The good news," James continued, "is that none of these transactions were permanent or irreversible. The bad news is that we're looking at potential criminal activity. Forging someone's signature on financial documents is serious business. Emma, if you want to pursue this legally, I can connect you with attorneys who specialize in family fraud cases." I sat in that expensive office chair, surrounded by law books and diplomas that represented decades of experience with human nature at its most calculating, and felt something shift inside me that I didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't anger, exactly, it was clarity. For 18 months, I had been swimming against a current I couldn't see, exhausting myself fighting invisible resistance. Now I could see the machinery that had been working against me, could understand why every conversation with Victoria left me feeling confused and diminished. "James," I said, "what would happen if we simply revoked the power of attorney and resumed normal operations of the trust?" "Legally, it's straightforward. Since the document was fraudulent, it never had any real authority anyway. We can file the paperwork to formalize that position and require all future transactions to go through proper channels. Practically, it means Victoria will lose access to financial resources she's been treating as her own for months. And my father?" James's expression grew complicated. That's where things get delicate. Robert is a beneficiary of the trust, but he's not a controlling party. Your mother structured it that way deliberately, I believe, because she understood that people sometimes make poor financial decisions when they're grieving or emotionally compromised. She wanted to ensure that the family's long-term security couldn't be jeopardized by short-term emotional reactions. I thought about my father's behavior over the past 18 months. The way he deferred to Victoria on financial matters. The way he seemed relieved when she offered to handle complicated paperwork and investment decisions. The way he had gradually withdrawn from active management of family business, content to let someone else navigate the complexity of wealth management, while he focused on his new marriage and the social obligations that came with Victoria's ambitious entertaining schedule. He hadn't been complicit in Victoria's fraud. He had been a victim of it, manipulated just as carefully as I had been, just through different emotional pressure points. Victoria had offered him the gift of simplicity during a time when everything in his life felt overwhelming. She had taken care of details he didn't want to think about, handled responsibilities he was happy to delegate, managed complexity he found exhausting. In return, she had gained access to financial resources that allowed her to build the social position she craved. I want to revoke everything, I said finally. All of it. And I want to restructure the trust so that these kinds of unauthorized transactions can't happen again. James smiled for the first time during our meeting. I think your mother would approve of that decision. She always said you had better instincts than you gave yourself credit for. Walking home through Central Park that evening, I thought about instincts and intuition and the ways we're taught to second-guess our own perceptions. For months, I had felt like something was wrong with the family dynamics, like conversations were happening in a language I didn't fully understand. Victoria's explanations for her behavior had always sounded reasonable on the surface, but they never quite eliminated the sense that important information was being withheld or distorted. Now I understood why. She had been operating from a position of knowledge I didn't possess, making decisions based on information she had deliberately kept from me. Every conversation we'd had about family finances, social obligations, or my role in the Richardson legacy had been built on lies. Not the dramatic, obvious kind of lies that would have triggered my defenses, but subtle distortions that made me question my own judgment rather than her motives. My phone buzzed as I reached the entrance to my building. A text from Victoria. Hope you enjoyed your afternoon at the club, sweetheart. Dad and I are having dinner at home tonight if you'd like to join. We're ordering from that Italian place you used to love. The casualness of the message felt almost surreal. She was texting me about dinner plans while sitting on forged documents that had given her access to hundreds of thousands of dollars of my inheritance. She was offering me leftover pasta while actively working to ensure I never understood the scope of my own financial resources. The audacity was breathtaking. I texted back, thanks, but I have plans tonight. Catching up on some family business I've been neglecting. Her response came immediately, nothing too complicated, I hope. You know Dad and I are always here if you need help navigating anything confusing. I stared at the message for a long time, marveling at the layers of manipulation packed into two seemingly innocent sentences. The suggestion that complex matters were beyond my capabilities. The positioning of herself and my father as a united front offering assistance. The implication that confusion on my part was natural and expected. Even now, knowing what I knew, she was still trying to manage my self-perception and keep me dependent on her interpretation of reality. That night, I spread the documents from James's office across my dining table and began constructing a timeline of Victoria's financial activities. Each transaction told a story about her priorities and methods. Money moved away from long-term investments that would benefit the entire family and into short-term projects that elevated her social status. Funds redirected from charitable causes my mother had supported into organizations where Victoria could gain recognition and board positions. Resources shifted from conservative financial instruments into riskier ventures that promised higher returns and greater visibility. But the pattern that emerged went beyond simple financial manipulation. Victoria had been systematically repositioning the Richardson family's resources to serve her vision of what our legacy should be. Less focus on quiet philanthropy and long-term stability. More emphasis on social prominence and immediate impact. She wasn't just stealing money. She was stealing the story of who we were as a family. The most disturbing discovery came when I found correspondence between Victoria and several high-end private schools. Applications for Madison's admission to institutions that cost more per year than many people's salaries. Tuition deposits paid from Richardson Holdings accounts. Scholarship applications that listed Madison as a Richardson family member, entitled to legacy admissions preferences based on our family's history of support for educational institutions. Victoria had been using my inheritance to purchase social advantages for her daughter, rewriting family history to position Madison as a legitimate heir to generations of Richardson educational and charitable involvement. She wasn't just managing money. She was manufacturing a genealogy that would give her child access to opportunities and social connections that had taken my family 3 generations to build. I closed the laptop and walked to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably having a quiet evening at home with my father, maybe discussing plans for their upcoming anniversary trip to Europe or reviewing guest lists for holiday parties. She was living a comfortable life, built on fraud, secure in the knowledge that her victim was too trusting, too inexperienced, or too intimidated to challenge her authority. But I wasn't any of those things anymore. I was Emma Richardson, granddaughter of Thomas Richardson, who had built a construction empire from nothing. Daughter of Grace Richardson, who had turned that empire into a charitable foundation that had funded dozens of scholarships and community programs. Legacy member of Pinehurst Country Club with voting rights that extended back 70 years. And tomorrow, I was going to start the process of taking back everything that had been stolen while I wasn't paying attention. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling. The kind of weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what would either be the most important day of my adult life or the beginning of a family war that would reshape every relationship I thought I understood. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that had been my mother's, adjusting the jacket that fit perfectly despite the years that had passed since her death. Looking in the mirror, I could see her cheekbones, her determined expression, the set of her shoulders when she was preparing for a difficult conversation. I arrived at Meridian Trust Bank 15 minutes before they opened, standing outside their mahogany doors while morning commuters hurried past on the sidewalk. When the security guard finally unlocked the entrance, I walked directly to the reception desk and asked to speak with whoever managed the Richardson Holdings account. Patricia Williams had been handling our family's financial affairs for 8 years, long enough to remember my mother's careful attention to detail and methodical approach to wealth management. She was a tall woman with prematurely silver hair, and the kind of precise movements that suggested she spent her days managing other people's complicated lives. When she reviewed my identification and pulled up the Richardson Holdings file on her computer, her expression shifted from professional politeness to something that looked like concern. "Richardson," she said, gesturing toward her private office. "I have to say, I was hoping to hear from you directly at some point. There have been some significant changes to the account activity over the past 6 months, and while Mrs. Victoria Richardson has been very thorough in her documentation, I've been somewhat uncomfortable with the scope of the transactions." We settled into chairs around a small conference table, and Patricia spread printouts across the surface with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this conversation. Account balances, transaction histories, investment performance reports, and correspondence files that painted a detailed picture of everything Victoria had been doing with money that wasn't technically hers to manage. The power of attorney document your stepmother provided gave her authority to handle routine account maintenance and minor investment adjustments, Patricia explained, highlighting relevant sections of the paperwork. However, some of the transactions she's initiated fall outside the scope of what I would consider routine maintenance. I reviewed the highlighted items, each one representing thousands of dollars moved without my knowledge or consent. The European vacation that had cost more than most people's annual salary. The private school tuition that would total over $200,000 by the time Madison graduated, the down payment on a vacation property in the Hamptons that was apparently being purchased under a Richardson Holdings subsidiary. Patricia, I said, looking up from the documents, I need you to know that I never signed a power of attorney authorizing Victoria Richardson to make any of these transactions. In fact, I was in California on the date this document claims to have been notarized. The color drained from Patricia's face as the implications of my statement settled over the room like fog. We weren't discussing aggressive financial management or family disagreements about spending priorities. We were talking about criminal fraud committed against one of the bank's longtime clients. Miss Richardson, she said carefully, are you absolutely certain about the timeline? Because if this power of attorney was fraudulently created, then every transaction processed under its authority was unauthorized, and we're looking at a very serious legal situation. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I had taken the night before. Plane tickets with my name and the relevant dates clearly visible. Conference schedule showing my speaking engagement. Hotel receipts from the San Francisco Marriott. Dinner receipts from restaurants 3,000 miles away from any notary who could have witnessed my signature on financial documents. Patricia excused herself to make several phone calls, leaving me alone in her office with the evidence of Victoria's systematic theft spread across the conference table. I thought about my stepmother's confidence during our lunch at Pinehurst, the way she had dismissed my presence with such casual authority. She had felt safe because she believed I was too naive or too intimidated to investigate the financial irregularities she had been creating for months. But confidence built on deception was just arrogance wearing a more socially acceptable mask. When Patricia returned, she was accompanied by two other bank officials whose expressions suggested they understood the gravity of what we were discussing. The senior vice president, a man with gray temples and expensive eyeglasses, introduced himself as David Chen and immediately began asking questions about my intentions regarding the fraudulent transactions. Miss Richardson, he said, we can reverse all unauthorized transactions immediately and freeze any accounts that may have been compromised. However, I need to warn you that taking this step will likely trigger legal consequences for anyone involved in creating or processing fraudulent documentation. I thought about my father, probably sitting at home reviewing architectural plans for his next home renovation project, unaware that his wife had been funding their lifestyle with money stolen from his daughter's inheritance. I thought about Madison, a teenager who had no involvement in her mother's crimes but would inevitably be affected by their consequences. I thought about Victoria, who had calculated that her charm and my inexperience would protect her from accountability. Reverse everything, I said, all of it. And I want documentation of every transaction so my attorney can determine what additional legal steps might be appropriate. David nodded grimly. We'll need a few hours to compile everything and process the reversals. Would you prefer to wait, or shall we call you when the documentation is ready? I checked my watch. It was barely 10 in the morning, but I felt like I had already lived through an entire day of confrontations and revelations. I'll wait, I said. I want to see exactly what was taken and make sure everything is properly restored. While the bank officials worked on reversing months of fraudulent transactions, I sat in Patricia's office and tried to process the emotional reality of what I had discovered. Victoria hadn't just stolen money, she had stolen my agency, my right to make decisions about my own financial future. She had stolen my mother's carefully designed legacy protections, turning them into weapons against the very person they were meant to protect. But perhaps most painfully, she had stolen my relationship with my father, creating a dynamic where I felt like a burden on his new happiness rather than a beloved daughter whose inheritance was being plundered to fund his wife's social ambitions. By the time the bank had finished its work, the October afternoon was fading into evening, and I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at documents that showed the true scope of Victoria's fraud. Over $400,000 in unauthorized transactions. Investment accounts drained to pay for luxury purchases. Educational funds diverted to cover private school expenses for a child who had no legal claim to Richardson family resources. But the number that made my hands shake wasn't the amount that had been stolen, it was the amount that remained. Even after months of Victoria's unauthorized spending, the Richardson Holdings Trust contained assets worth over $8 million. My mother had left me wealthy enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to pursue any career or educational opportunity that interested me, to support charitable causes I cared about, to build a legacy that honored the values she had tried to instill in me. Victoria had been stealing from a fortune large enough that her theft, while morally devastating, hadn't actually threatened my long-term financial security. She had risked felony charges and destroyed family relationships to get access to money that represented a fraction of my actual inheritance. The mathematical stupidity of her crime was almost as insulting as its emotional cruelty. I drove home through Manhattan traffic, my phone buzzing with text messages I wasn't ready to read. By the time I reached my apartment, Victoria had sent 6 increasingly urgent messages asking about my plans for the evening and whether I was feeling all right after our lunch at the club. The tone progressed from casual concern to barely concealed anxiety, suggesting that someone at Meridian Trust Bank had already contacted her about unusual account activity. Instead of responding to her texts, I opened the final sealed envelope from my mother's jewelry box, the one I had been too emotionally exhausted to examine the night before. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a phone number written in my mother's careful script, along with a note that made my breath catch in my throat. Emma, if Victoria has been as calculating as I fear, you'll need allies who understand how these games are played. Call this number, and tell them Grace Richardson's daughter needs help navigating family politics. They'll know what that means. I stared at the note for a long time, wondering what kind of help my mother had arranged, what resources she had put in place to protect me from scenarios she had hoped would never materialize. Finally, I picked up my phone and dialed the number, not sure what to expect but certain that whatever came next would change everything about the life I thought I was living. The voice that answered was warm, professional, and immediately familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. Richardson Family Matters, the woman said, as if she had been expecting my call for months. This is Linda Peterson. I assume you're ready to discuss your stepmother's financial activities and what we're going to do about them. Linda Peterson's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of wealthy family disputes. When I arrived at her Madison Avenue office the following morning, I found myself in a space that felt more like a private library than a traditional law firm. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and the mahogany desk could have hosted diplomatic negotiations between small countries. Your mother was one of my closest friends, Linda said, settling into a leather chair that had probably witnessed countless family crises over the years. When she was diagnosed, she asked me to keep an eye on the situation with Victoria. Grace had excellent instincts about people, and she was deeply concerned about your stepmother's motivations. I sat across from her, still trying to process that my mother had been planning for this confrontation months before her death. How long have you known what Victoria was doing? I've been monitoring certain financial activities since about 3 months after the wedding, Linda replied, opening a file that was significantly thicker than I had expected. Your mother asked me to document any irregularities, but not to intervene unless you specifically requested help. She wanted you to discover the problems on your own timeline, in your own way. The file contained photographs, bank statements, legal documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports detailing Victoria's activities over the past year. There were images of her at expensive restaurants with people I didn't recognize, receipts from jewelry stores showing purchases that far exceeded what my father's salary could support, and correspondence with private investigators who had been tracking her financial behavior with surgical precision. Emma, Linda continued, what you discovered at the bank yesterday represents only the visible portion of a much larger pattern of deception. Victoria has been systematically positioning herself to gain permanent control over Richardson family assets, and forging your signature was just the beginning of her strategy. She handed me a document that made my stomach drop, a petition for guardianship that Victoria had filed with the probate court, claiming that I was emotionally unstable following my mother's death and required professional oversight of my financial affairs. The petition was supported by statements from a psychiatrist I had never met, describing therapy sessions that had never occurred, and medication prescriptions for conditions I didn't have. This is completely fabricated, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I've never seen this doctor. I've never been prescribed any of these medications. I know, Linda replied gently, but Victoria was building a legal case that would have allowed her to take permanent control of your inheritance while portraying herself as a caring stepmother protecting a vulnerable young woman. If this petition had been approved, you would have lost all legal authority over your own financial decisions. The scope of Victoria's manipulation was beginning to crystallize in ways that made my hands shake. She hadn't just been stealing money. She had been constructing an elaborate legal framework that would have made her theft permanent and unquestionable. The forged power of attorney was never intended to be a long-term solution. It was meant to provide temporary access while she built a case for permanent guardianship. The good news, Linda continued, is that your mother anticipated this possibility and took steps to protect you. The bad news is that Victoria has been more thorough and aggressive than we initially expected. She's created a network of fraudulent documentation that extends far beyond simple financial manipulation. Linda spread additional documents across her desk, each one revealing another layer of Victoria's systematic deception. Medical records showing treatments I had never received, insurance claims for therapy sessions that had never occurred, employment records suggesting I had been fired from jobs I had never held, academic transcripts showing failing grades at institutions I had never attended. She's been creating a comprehensive profile of mental instability and professional incompetence, Linda explained. Every document is designed to support her narrative that you're incapable of managing your own affairs and need her intervention to prevent self-destruction. I stared at the fabricated medical records, recognizing my own social security number and personal information, but nothing else about the person they purported to describe. According to these documents, I was a depressed, anxious, unemployed woman with a history of poor financial decisions and substance abuse problems. The fictional Emma Richardson needed protection from herself, and Victoria Richardson was generously providing that protection despite the burden it placed on her own life. How is this even possible? I asked. How did she get access to my personal information? How did she create medical records
without any actual doctors being involved? Linda's expression grew grimmer. There are people who specialize in creating false documentation for wealthy individuals involved in family disputes. It's more common than you might think, and the services are surprisingly sophisticated. Victoria has been paying significant amounts to professional document forgers who understand exactly how to make fabricated records look authentic to casual review. She pulled out another set of documents that showed payments from Richardson Holdings accounts to companies with names like Family Consultation Services and Personal Documentation Management. Each payment was for amounts that seemed reasonable for legitimate professional services, but when added together over months, they represented tens of thousands of dollars spent on creating false evidence of my incompetence. The most disturbing aspect, Linda continued, is how carefully she's been timing these fabrications. Every document is dated to correspond with periods when you were traveling for work or otherwise unavailable. She's created a timeline that suggests ongoing medical and professional problems while ensuring that you were never present to contradict her narratives. I thought about the various business trips I had taken over the past 18 months, the conferences and client meetings that had kept me away from New York for days at a time. Each absence had apparently been an opportunity for Victoria to schedule fictitious appointments, create false records, and build her case for legal guardianship without any risk of my accidental presence undermining her fabricated stories. "Linda," I said, "what happens now? How do we stop her?" "Your mother left very specific instructions about how to handle this situation," she replied, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written in familiar handwriting. "She wanted me to give this to you only after you had discovered the scope of Victoria's activities and decided to fight back." Inside the envelope was a letter that was shorter than the others my mother had left, but every word carried the weight of careful planning and maternal protection. "My dearest Emma," it read, "if you're reading this with Linda, then Victoria has revealed herself to be exactly as dangerous as I feared. What you're feeling right now, the betrayal, the anger, the sense that your entire reality has been manipulated, is completely justified. But don't let emotion drive your next decisions. Victoria is skilled at psychological manipulation, and she will try to convince you that fighting her will destroy your relationship with your father and damage the family permanently. She will position herself as the victim of your unreasonable accusations and paint you as an ungrateful daughter who can't accept her father's happiness. Don't believe her. Fight strategically, fight smart, and remember that the best revenge against someone who has underestimated you is proving them wrong in ways they never saw coming." The letter concluded with specific instructions about financial accounts I didn't know existed, legal strategies that had been prepared in advance, and resources that had been quietly assembled to support exactly the kind of confrontation I was now facing. "Your mother was remarkably thorough," Linda observed as I finished reading. "She established a separate legal fund specifically to cover the costs of challenging Victoria's activities. She also arranged for private investigators, document experts, and financial forensic specialists to be available if needed. She really saw all of this coming. Grace understood that grief makes people vulnerable, and she knew your father well enough to predict that he might be susceptible to someone who offered to simplify his life during a difficult time. She also recognized that Victoria's interest in your family was primarily financial rather than emotional." Linda handed me yet another file, this one containing background research on Victoria that painted a disturbing picture of her previous relationships. 2 prior marriages to wealthy older men, both ending in divorce settlements that left her significantly wealthier than when the marriages began. A pattern of befriending recently widowed men at social events, charity functions, and grief support groups. Professional connections to financial advisors, attorneys, and medical professionals who had assisted in previous family disputes involving inheritance claims. "Victoria isn't just opportunistic," Linda explained. "She's professional. This isn't her first time manipulating a grieving widower and his family. She has a documented pattern of targeting vulnerable wealthy men and systematically gaining control over their financial resources." The revelation hit me like ice water. My father's romance, which I had assumed was simply a case of poor timing and questionable judgment, was actually a carefully orchestrated campaign by someone who had identified him as a suitable target for financial exploitation. Victoria's interest in our family had nothing to do with love or companionship and everything to do with gaining access to the Richardson Holdings Trust. Does my father know any of this? I asked. Not yet, Linda replied. Your mother's instructions were very specific about the order in which information should be revealed. She wanted you to understand the full scope of what you were facing before we brought Robert into the conversation. She was concerned that he might be too emotionally invested in his relationship with Victoria to accept evidence of her deception without significant resistance. I thought about my father's behavior over the past 18 months, the way he had gradually withdrawn from family business decisions, the way he seemed relieved when Victoria offered to handle complicated financial matters, the way he appeared genuinely happy for the first time since my mother's death, grateful to have found someone who made his life feel less empty and overwhelming. Victoria hadn't just targeted his wealth, she had targeted his emotional vulnerabilities, offering companionship and practical support during the most difficult period of his adult life. The cruelty of her manipulation extended beyond financial theft into emotional abuse of a man who was still learning how to live without his partner of 30 years. What my mother is asking, I said slowly, is for me to destroy my father's happiness in order to protect his money. Linda's expression softened slightly. What your mother is asking is for you to protect your father from someone who views him as a means to an end rather than as a person deserving of genuine affection. Victoria's feelings for Robert are entirely conditional on his continued usefulness in providing access to family resources. If she gained permanent control over the trust, how long do you think her interest in maintaining their marriage would last? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. I tried to imagine Victoria's behavior toward my father if she no longer needed his cooperation to access Richardson family money. Would she continue the attentive wife performance if it no longer served her financial objectives? Would she maintain the social facade if she could achieve her goals through legal guardianship rather than marital manipulation? Your mother believed, Linda continued, that your father deserves the opportunity to make informed decisions about his relationship. Right now, he's operating from incomplete information. He doesn't know about the forged documents, the fabricated medical records, or Victoria's history of similar relationships with other wealthy widowers. He can't make good choices about his future without understanding who he's actually married to. I spent the next hour reviewing additional evidence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Victoria's activities. Financial records showing suspicious transfers between her personal accounts and entities controlled by people who had assisted in her previous marriage disputes. Communications with attorneys who specialized in inheritance challenges and guardianship petitions. Correspondence with private investigators who had been researching my personal life, employment history, and social relationships for months. She's been preparing for a comprehensive legal assault on your competence and your rights, Linda explained. The financial theft was just the opening move. If you hadn't discovered the problems when you did, you would have eventually found yourself facing guardianship proceedings supported by extensive documentation of your alleged mental health problems and professional failures. But the most chilling discovery was a series of emails between Victoria and a medical professional discussing strategies for involuntary psychiatric commitment. The correspondence suggested that Victoria had been exploring options for having me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized if the guardianship petition proved insufficient to gain control over my inheritance. This is criminal, I said, staring at communications that discussed my potential confinement as if it were a minor administrative matter. Yes, Linda agreed, it is. And it's also why your mother was so adamant that you understand the full scope of what you're facing before taking any action. Victoria isn't just greedy, she's dangerous, she's willing to destroy lives to achieve her financial objectives, and she has access to professional resources that make her capable of carrying out sophisticated attacks on your freedom and your sanity. The weight of my mother's protection was beginning to settle over me like armor I hadn't known I needed. Every sealed envelope, every prepared legal strategy, every carefully researched document represented hours of planning by someone who had understood exactly what battles I would need to fight and had armed me accordingly. Linda, I said, what would have happened if I hadn't called you? If I had tried to handle this on my own? Honestly, Victoria probably would have succeeded. She's had professional help, months of preparation, and the advantage of your trust and inexperience. Most people facing this kind of systematic manipulation end up overwhelmed and defeated. Your mother's preparations are the only reason you have a realistic chance of protecting yourself and your father. I left Linda's office that afternoon, carrying copies of everything she had shown me, along with detailed instructions about the next steps in what was beginning to feel less like a family dispute and more like a war for survival. The evidence filled 3 banker's boxes that barely fit in the back seat of my car, each box containing documentation of crimes that could result in serious prison time for anyone involved in their creation. Driving home through Manhattan traffic, I thought about the dinner invitation Victoria had extended the night before, the casual friendliness of her text messages, the apparent normalcy of her interactions with my father. She was living a double life with professional precision, maintaining her performance as a loving wife and concerned stepmother while simultaneously building a legal framework designed to destroy my freedom and my future. But what struck me most was the realization that she had underestimated me in exactly the same way she had underestimated my mother. She had assumed that grief, inexperience, and social conditioning would prevent me from fighting back effectively. She had believed that I would accept her narrative about my own incompetence and be grateful for her protection rather than suspicious of her motives. She was about to discover that Richardson women were significantly more dangerous than she had calculated. That evening I sat in my apartment with the banker's boxes open around me, sorting through evidence of crimes I was still struggling to fully comprehend. Each document told a story about predatory behavior that extended far beyond simple financial theft. Victoria had been attempting to steal my identity, my autonomy, my relationship with my father, and ultimately my freedom. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. She had confused gentleness with vulnerability and mistaken kindness for naivety. Those misconceptions were about to cost her everything she had worked 18 months to achieve. My phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. "Emma, sweetheart, you've been so quiet lately. Dad and I are worried about you. Why don't you come for brunch this weekend? We can catch up on everything that's been happening." I stared at the message for a long time, marveling at her ability to maintain the concerned stepmother performance while simultaneously building a case for my involuntary commitment to psychiatric care. The audacity was almost artistic in its completeness. I typed back, "Thanks for the invitation. I've been busy with some family business, but I think we should definitely get together soon. There are some things we need to discuss." Her response came immediately, "Of course, dear. Family business can be so overwhelming. Remember that Dad and I are always here to help if anything gets too complicated for you to handle alone." Even now, knowing what I knew, she was still trying to plant seeds of self-doubt and dependence. The psychological manipulation was so consistent it felt like muscle memory, an automatic response to any sign that I might be taking independent action. But this time, her words had no power over me. I understood exactly what she was doing and why. More importantly, I had the resources and support to stop her. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Linda Peterson, outlining a strategy that would expose Victoria's activities while protecting my father from unnecessary emotional trauma. It was going to be delicate work, requiring careful timing and precise execution. But for the first time in 18 months, I felt like I was operating from a position of strength, rather than defending against attacks I couldn't see coming. The next morning brought an unexpected call from Marcus at Pinehurst Country Club. His voice carried an urgency that immediately caught my attention. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but there's been some unusual activity regarding your membership that I thought you should know about." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of activity?" "Mrs. Victoria Richardson was here yesterday afternoon, meeting with Mrs. Garrett about transferring your membership to a different category. She had paperwork suggesting that you wanted to downgrade from legacy member status to social member, which would eliminate your voting rights and committee privileges." The boldness of Victoria's latest move took my breath away. She wasn't content with stealing my money, she was now attempting to strip me of the social status and institutional power that came with my family's founding membership at the club. Marcus, I said, did Mrs. Garrett process any of this paperwork? No, ma'am. She said she would need to speak with you directly before making any changes to a legacy membership. But Mrs. Victoria seemed quite confident that you had requested the change, and appeared surprised when Mrs. Garrett insisted on confirmation. After hanging up with Marcus, I called Mrs. Garrett directly to confirm that my membership remained unchanged and to place a security hold preventing any modifications without my physical presence and additional identification. But the incident revealed something important about Victoria's state of mind. She was accelerating her timeline, making increasingly aggressive moves that suggested she felt pressure to consolidate her gains quickly. Either she suspected that I was beginning to understand her activities, or she had a specific deadline that required her to complete her takeover of Richardson family resources within a certain time frame. Either possibility meant that the relatively subtle approach she had been taking for months was about to give way to more direct attacks on my rights and my freedom. That afternoon, I met with Linda Peterson again to discuss how Victoria's club membership gambit fit into the larger pattern of her activities. She's getting desperate, Linda observed after reviewing my account of the morning's phone calls. The fact that she's making moves this obvious suggests that she knows her window of opportunity is closing. Either someone has warned her that we're investigating her activities, or she has reasons to believe that her current level of access to family resources won't last much longer. What kind of reasons? Linda pulled out a calendar and began marking dates with a red pen. Your father's birthday is next month. According to the trust documents your mother left, Robert gains additional control over family assets when he turns 55. If Victoria wants to maintain her current level of influence over Richardson Holdings, she needs to either secure permanent guardianship over you, or convince Robert to restructure the trust before his birthday changes the power dynamics. The timeline suddenly made perfect sense. Victoria hadn't been working towards some vague long-term goal, she had been racing against a specific deadline that would automatically reduce her ability to manipulate family finances. My father's 55th birthday was 6 weeks away, and with it would come changes to the trust structure that Victoria couldn't prevent through forged documents or manufactured medical crises. So she has 6 weeks to either destroy me legally, or convince my father to sign over permanent control of the trust. Exactly, and given that she's been building a case for your incompetence for months, I suspect she's planning to accelerate the guardianship petition. She'll probably claim that your recent behavior, questioning her authority, investigating family finances, challenging her decisions, represents a dangerous escalation of your alleged mental health problems. I thought about the fabricated psychiatric records Linda had shown me, the fictional narrative of depression and instability that Victoria had been constructing without my knowledge. Every action I took to protect myself could be reframed as evidence supporting her claims about my emotional fragility and poor judgment. She's put me in an impossible position, I realized. If I fight her, she'll use my resistance as proof that I'm unstable. If I don't fight her, she'll gain permanent control over my inheritance and my freedom. That's exactly the trap she's been building, Linda agreed. It's a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, designed to make you feel helpless and confused. But she's made one significant miscalculation. Linda smiled for the first time since I had met her, an expression that contained equal parts warmth and predatory satisfaction. She assumes you're fighting alone, with limited resources and no professional support. She has no idea that your mother spent months preparing for this exact confrontation, and provided you with everything you need, to not just defend yourself, but to completely destroy her ability to threaten you or your father in the future. What do you mean? Linda opened the largest file she had yet shown me, revealing documents that made my hands shake with their implications. Corporate records showing that several of the companies Victoria had been paying for fraudulent services were actually controlled by Linda's law firm. Financial records indicating that every payment Victoria had made for false documentation had been carefully tracked and recorded. Communications proving that the medical professionals who had created fake psychiatric records were actually working undercover for investigators hired by my mother. Your mother didn't just prepare legal defenses against Victoria's activities, Linda explained. She created an elaborate sting operation designed to gather evidence of criminal behavior, while Victoria believed she was successfully building her case against you. The scope of my mother's strategy was breathtaking in its complexity and ruthlessness. While I had been struggling with feelings of confusion and social inadequacy, an entire network of legal and investigative professionals had been documenting Victoria's crimes with methodical precision. Every move Victoria has made over the past year has been recorded, photographed, and preserved as evidence. Every forged document, every falsified record, every payment to criminal co-conspirators, all of it has been carefully documented by people she believed were helping her destroy you. I stared at the evidence Linda had spread across her desk, trying to process the reality that my mother had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations I could imagine, all designed to protect a daughter she knew would be too trusting and too inexperienced to defend herself effectively. She really loved me, I whispered, overwhelmed by the scope of the protection my mother had provided from beyond the grave. More than you know, Linda replied. And now it's time to use her gift to teach Victoria Richardson what happens when someone underestimates the women of this family. The conference room at Pinehurst Country Club had never hosted anything quite like this before. Linda Peterson had reserved the space for what she diplomatically termed a family financial consultation, though everyone present understood they were witnessing the systematic destruction of an 18-month criminal conspiracy. Victoria sat across from me at the polished oak table, her designer suit impeccable as always, but something brittle had crept into her posture that suggested she was beginning to understand that this wasn't going to be another performance where she controlled the narrative. My father occupied the chair at the head of the table, looking confused and slightly irritated at being summoned to what he had been told was a routine discussion of trust administration. He had arrived 10 minutes early, chatting pleasantly with Mrs. Garrett about golf course conditions and club renovations, completely unaware that he was about to witness the complete destruction of everything he thought he knew about his wife. Linda had orchestrated the meeting with surgical precision. David Chen from Meridian Trust Bank sat to her right, flanked by Patricia Williams, whose expression suggested she was looking forward to this conversation with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for particularly satisfying revenge. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Financial Crimes Division occupied a chair near the window, her presence lending an air of official authority that made Victoria's eyes dart nervously toward the exits. "Thank you all for coming," Linda began, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that preceded devastating revelations. "We're here to discuss some irregularities that have been discovered in the administration of Richardson family financial affairs, and to determine the appropriate steps for addressing these irregularities." Victoria's smile remained perfectly calibrated, but I noticed the slight tension around her eyes that indicated she was working harder than usual to maintain her composure. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I'm happy to clarify any questions about the work I've been doing to help Robert and Emma navigate their financial responsibilities. It's been challenging, coordinating everything while Emma has been dealing with her personal difficulties, but we've managed quite well." The opening gambit was textbook Victoria. Establish herself as the competent administrator, position me as the problem requiring her management, and frame any challenges to her authority as ingratitude for her dedicated service. 6 months ago, her approach would have left me feeling defensive and apologetic. Today, it felt like watching someone walk confidently into quicksand. "Mrs. Richardson," Patricia Williams said, opening the first of several thick folders, "can you explain the authorization for the transfer of $47,000 from the Richardson Holdings Education Fund to Whitmore Academy for Madison Richardson's tuition deposit?" "Certainly," Victoria replied, without hesitation. Emma had expressed concerns about Madison's educational opportunities, and we felt it was appropriate to use family resources to ensure she had access to quality education. The Richardson family has always valued academic excellence. My father's eyebrows rose slightly. This was the first he was hearing about my supposed involvement in his stepdaughter's educational planning, but he remained silent, apparently waiting to understand the purpose of this gathering before forming opinions about its revelations. I see, Patricia continued. And can you show us Emma's signature authorizing this expenditure? Victoria's pause was barely perceptible, but in a room full of people who understood financial fraud, it might as well have been a neon sign. I believe Emma provided verbal authorization during one of our family discussions. She was going through a particularly difficult period at the time, so we tried to minimize the paperwork that might add to her stress. Mrs. Richardson, Detective Martinez interjected, are you familiar with the legal requirements for disbursing funds from educational trusts, specifically, the documentation required for expenditures exceeding $10,000? I'm not an attorney, Victoria replied, her voice still steady, but carrying a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. I was simply trying to help my family navigate complex financial arrangements during a difficult time. Linda Peterson opened her own folder, revealing documents that I recognized from our previous meetings. Victoria, I'd like you to examine this power of attorney document that you provided to Meridian Trust Bank, authorizing you to make financial decisions on Emma's behalf. Victoria accepted the document with the confidence of someone who had examined her own handiwork many times before. Yes, Emma and I completed this paperwork when she was feeling overwhelmed by her financial responsibilities. She was grateful for the assistance. Can you tell us the date on that document? September 15th of last year. Where was this document signed and notarized? Victoria's answer came smoothly, obviously rehearsed. At the Meridian Trust Bank office on Madison Avenue, with their staff notary providing witness services. Linda nodded thoughtfully, then gestured to David Chen. David, could you please tell us what Emma Richardson was doing on September 15th of last year? David consulted his own notes, though I suspected he had memorized the relevant information long before entering the room. According to the documentation Emma provided to us yesterday, she was in San Francisco, California, delivering a keynote presentation at the National Cybersecurity Conference. The conference ran from September 13th through September 16th. The silence that followed was beautiful in its completeness. Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral, but I watched her hands tighten almost imperceptibly in her lap. My father's confusion was shifting towards something that looked like the first stirrings of suspicion. Victoria, he said quietly, Emma was definitely in California that week. I remember because she called to tell me about the standing ovation she received after her presentation. She was so excited about the professional recognition. People can be mistaken about dates, Victoria replied, her voice maintaining its reasonable tone despite the obvious strain. It's easy to confuse travel schedules when you're dealing with
emotional stress. Linda Peterson's smile was gentle and absolutely ruthless. Of course they can. That's why we've gathered some additional documentation to help clarify the timeline. She nodded to Patricia, who began distributing photographs that made Victoria's face go visibly pale. The images showed me at the San Francisco Marriott, timestamp clearly visible, checking in at the hotel reception desk, me at the conference registration table, accepting my speaker credentials from smiling volunteers. Me on stage during my presentation, the conference banner and date clearly visible behind the podium. Me at the conference dinner, seated between colleagues whose faces would be familiar to anyone who followed developments in cybersecurity. These photographs, Linda continued conversationally, were taken by professional conference photographers and archived by the event organizers. The timestamps are embedded in the digital files and match the hotel security footage that shows Emma's presence in San Francisco throughout the weekend in question. Victoria stared at the photographs for a long moment, her composure finally beginning to crack around the edges.
There must be some confusion about the dates. Emma and I have discussed financial matters on multiple occasions. Perhaps I mixed up the specific timing. Perhaps, Linda agreed. Let's examine some of the other documentation to see if we can clarify the timeline. She produced another set of papers. These are the medical records you provided to support your petition for guardianship, showing Emma's treatment for depression and anxiety disorders. Can you tell us which medical professionals provided these treatments? Dr. Amanda Foster at Manhattan Psychiatric Associates. Victoria replied, consulting her own notes. Dr. Foster has been working with Emma for several months to address her emotional difficulties following Grace's death. Linda nodded and produced her phone. Would you be surprised to learn that Dr. Amanda Foster has been working undercover for our investigation since January of this year? That every appointment listed in these medical records was actually a meeting where Dr. Foster documented your requests for fabricated psychiatric evaluations. The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly I was genuinely concerned she might faint. My father's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching horror as he began to understand the scope of what he was witnessing. Victoria, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, what is she talking about? Before Victoria could respond, Linda continued her methodical destruction of every lie that had been carefully constructed over the past 18 months. Dr. Foster has provided us with detailed records of your visits, including recordings of your conversations where you explicitly discussed creating false evidence of Emma's mental instability to support legal proceedings that would give you permanent control over Richardson family assets. Detective Martinez leaned forward, her expression professionally neutral but alert. Mrs. Richardson, I should inform you that creating false medical records and forging signatures on legal documents constitute multiple felonies under New York state law. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to consult with an attorney before answering any further questions. Victoria's carefully maintained facade finally shattered completely. The confident socialite who had orchestrated 18 months of systematic manipulation dissolved into someone who looked remarkably small and frightened, sitting in a chair that suddenly seemed too large for her diminished presence. This is a misunderstanding, she said, her voice high and strained. Everything I did was to help this family. Emma wasn't handling her responsibilities appropriately. Someone needed to step in and provide guidance. I was protecting her from making poor decisions that could have damaged the family financially. By forging her signature, my father asked, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard before. By creating fake medical records, by stealing money from trusts that weren't yours to access. Victoria turned toward him with desperate eyes, reaching for his hand across the table. Robert, you know how fragile Emma has been since Grace died. You've seen how she withdraws from social situations, how she avoids family responsibilities. I was trying to create a stable structure that would protect her while allowing the family to function properly. But my father pulled his hand away, staring at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time since they had met. Emma hasn't been fragile, Victoria. She's been investigating. She's been protecting herself from you. The truth of that statement settled over the room like dust after an explosion. For 18 months, every behavior Victoria had attributed to my emotional instability had actually been evidence of my growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with our family dynamics. My withdrawal from social events hadn't been depression, it had been self-protection. My questions about financial decisions hadn't been evidence of incompetence. They had been the early stages of an investigation that had ultimately exposed criminal fraud. Linda Peterson continued presenting evidence with relentless precision. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers, communications with document forgers, correspondence with private investigators who had been researching my personal life for information that could be used against me. Financial records showing payments to medical professionals for fabricated psychiatric evaluations. Each revelation built on the previous one, creating an overwhelming picture of systematic criminal conspiracy. The scope of Mrs. Richardson's activities, Linda explained, extends far beyond simple financial theft. She has attempted to destroy Emma's reputation, compromise her legal rights, and create grounds for involuntary psychiatric commitment. This represents one of the most comprehensive cases of family financial fraud our office has encountered. Victoria made one final attempt to control the narrative, turning toward me with tears that might have been genuine or might have been performance art. "Emma, you have to understand, everything I did was because I care about this family. Your mother asked me to take care of Robert, to help him navigate the complexities of managing family wealth. I was trying to honor her wishes while protecting everyone involved. The manipulation was so breathtaking in its audacity that I found myself almost admiring her commitment to the performance. Even now, facing criminal charges and the complete destruction of her carefully constructed life, Victoria was still trying to reframe her crimes as selfless service to family needs. Victoria, I said quietly, my mother never asked you to take care of anyone. In fact, she spent the last months of her life preparing legal defenses against exactly the kind of behavior you've been engaging in. She knew what you were planning before you even married my father." I gestured to Linda, who produced the final piece of evidence that my mother had prepared. A videotaped deposition that Grace Richardson had recorded shortly before her death, sealed with specific instructions that it should be played only in the event that Victoria Richardson attempted to gain unauthorized control over family assets. The conference room fell silent as my mother's voice filled the space, speaking with the clarity and precision of someone who understood exactly what battles would be fought after her death. "If you're watching this recording," my mother's image said from Linda's laptop screen, "then Victoria has revealed herself to be exactly as dangerous as I suspected. She approached Robert at my funeral. Victoria and I watched you calculating the value of his grief while he was still holding my hand. You've never loved my husband. You've never cared about my daughter. You've seen my family as a financial opportunity, and you've spent months trying to steal what doesn't belong to you." Victoria stared at the screen in horror, watching her mother-in-law speak from beyond the grave with knowledge that destroyed any remaining pretense about her motivations or methods. "I've had you investigated, Victoria. I know about your previous marriages, your pattern of targeting wealthy widowers, your network of professionals who specialize in creating false documentation for inheritance disputes. I know about the companies you've established to launder stolen funds, the medical professionals you've bribed to create fraudulent psychiatric records, and the attorneys you've consulted about gaining guardianship over vulnerable family members." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, methodically destroying every aspect of Victoria's criminal enterprise, while providing specific evidence that would support prosecution for multiple felonies. My mother had spent her final months creating an airtight case against someone she had never fully trusted, leaving no avenue for escape or plausible denial. When the recording ended, Victoria sat motionless in her chair, staring at the blank laptop screen as if hoping it might provide some miraculous explanation for how her perfectly planned criminal conspiracy had been anticipated and countered by someone who had died before she could complete it. Detective Martinez stood up, reaching for handcuffs that caught the afternoon light streaming through the conference room windows. "Victoria Richardson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The arrest proceeded with professional efficiency, though Victoria's composure finally collapsed completely as the handcuffs clicked into place. She looked around the room desperately, searching for sympathy or support that wasn't coming. My father watched his wife being arrested for stealing from his daughter with an expression that combined heartbreak with something that looked like relief. After Detective Martinez escorted Victoria from the building, the remaining participants in our devastating conference sat in silence for several minutes, processing the emotional impact of what had just occurred.
My father looked older than his years, staring out the window at the golf course where he had once played with my mother on Saturday mornings. "Emma," he said finally, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make. I brought someone into our family who spent 18 months trying to destroy you, and I was too blind to see what was happening." "Dad," I replied, "she was a professional. This wasn't the first time she's done this to a family. You were grieving and vulnerable, and she targeted that vulnerability with surgical precision. You're a victim too." Linda Peterson began gathering the evidence files, preparing for the legal proceedings that would unfold over the coming months. "Robert," she said gently, "you should know that Grace anticipated this conversation too. She left specific instructions about helping you recover from Victoria's psychological manipulation and rebuild your relationship with Emma." My father's eyes filled with tears as he considered the scope of his late wife's protection, the way she had prepared defenses not just for me, but for him as well. She really saw all of this coming. "She understood human nature," Linda replied. "She knew that grief makes people vulnerable, and she knew Victoria well enough to predict exactly how that vulnerability would be exploited. More importantly, she knew that both of you were strong enough to survive this experience and come out stronger on the other side." Over the following weeks, the full extent of Victoria's criminal activities was revealed through ongoing investigation and her eventual cooperation with prosecutors seeking reduced sentences. Her previous marriages had indeed followed similar patterns, targeting recently widowed men with substantial assets and systematically gaining control over family resources through manipulation, fraud, and false documentation. The private school that had received Madison's tuition payments was required to refund the money when it was revealed to have been stolen from educational trusts. The vacation property Victoria had been purchasing with Richardson Holdings funds was seized as evidence of criminal activity. The expensive jewelry, cars, and luxury items she had acquired during her marriage were liquidated to provide restitution for her theft. But perhaps most significantly, the network of professionals who had assisted in creating false documentation was exposed and prosecuted, eliminating a criminal enterprise that had been preying on vulnerable wealthy families for years. My mother's investigation had uncovered not just Victoria's individual crimes, but an entire industry built around inheritance fraud and family manipulation. The legal proceedings took months to resolve, but Victoria ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felonies and received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, followed by supervised probation and mandatory restitution. Madison, who had been unaware of her mother's criminal activities, was placed in the care of her biological father and received counseling to help her process the traumatic revelation that her privileged lifestyle had been funded through theft and fraud. My father began therapy to address the psychological impact of Victoria's manipulation, working with professionals who specialized in helping victims of sophisticated emotional abuse. The process was difficult and occasionally heartbreaking, as he came to understand how completely his perceptions and decisions had been controlled by someone he had trusted completely. But gradually we began to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and honest communication. The experience had taught both of us important lessons about trust, vulnerability, and the difference between kindness and naivety. We were both stronger for having survived Victoria's assault on our family, and our bond was ultimately deeper than it had been before my mother's death. 6 months after Victoria's arrest, I stood in the same conference room at Pinehurst Country Club, addressing the Legacy Members' Quarterly meeting as the newly elected chair of the Charitable Giving Committee. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was occupying a position Victoria had desperately wanted but could never have achieved, given that her spouse membership had never entitled her to leadership roles within the club. My presentation focused on establishing new scholarship programs for students pursuing careers in financial crimes investigation, funded by the Richardson Holdings Trust, and designed to honor my mother's memory while serving the broader community. The assembled members approved the initiative unanimously, recognizing both the importance of the cause and the appropriateness of using our family's experience to help others facing similar challenges. After the meeting, Marcus approached me near the valet stand, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice prevail against considerable odds. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I hope you don't mind me saying that your mother would be incredibly proud of how you handled everything. She always said you had more strength than you realized, and she was absolutely right." Driving home through the familiar streets of Westchester, I thought about strength and resilience, and the ways we discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. Victoria had targeted what she perceived as weakness, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Richardson family character. We weren't weak because we were kind, we weren't vulnerable because we trusted, we weren't naive because we gave people the benefit of the doubt. We were strategic, patient, and ultimately far more dangerous than anyone who underestimated us would ever realize. The final piece of my mother's preparation had been a trust fund established specifically for me, separate from the Richardson holding structure and immune from the kind of manipulation Victoria had attempted. The fund contained not just financial resources, but also detailed instructions for using wealth responsibly, maintaining family values across generations, and protecting future Richardson family members from the kind of predatory behavior we had experienced. Sitting in my apartment that evening, reviewing the documents that transferred complete control of this trust to me on my 30th birthday, I found a letter from my mother that brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Emma," it read, "if you're reading this, then you've survived Victoria's assault on our family and emerged stronger than you were before. You've learned that being kind doesn't require being weak, that trusting people doesn't mean failing to verify their actions, and that quiet strength is often more powerful than loud confrontation. These are lessons that will serve you well throughout your life, in situations that have nothing to do with inheritance disputes or family fraud. You are a Richardson woman, which means you are capable of surviving anything and protecting everyone you love. Use that power wisely, and remember that the best revenge against people who underestimate you is proving them wrong in ways they never saw coming." The letter concluded with specific instructions about charitable giving, family legacy preservation, and the importance of remaining vigilant against future threats, while not allowing suspicion to diminish my capacity for joy and connection with others. But perhaps most importantly, it reminded me that Victoria's assault on our family, while traumatic and devastating, had ultimately failed to achieve its primary objective. She had tried to steal not just money, but identity, belonging, and the sense of security that comes from knowing you're valued and protected by people who love you unconditionally. She had taken money that could be restored, damaged relationships that could be repaired, and created trauma that could be healed. But she had never touched the essential core of who I was, or what the Richardson family represented. That had remained inviolate throughout her 18 months of systematic manipulation, protected by my mother's foresight and strengthened by my own resilience. 3 years later, I delivered the keynote address at a national conference on family financial fraud, sharing the story of Victoria's crimes and my mother's counter-strategy with an audience of attorneys, law enforcement professionals, and victim advocates. The presentation was titled "The Long Game: How Preparation and Patience Can Defeat Sophisticated Family Predators," and it received a standing ovation from people who understood exactly how rare and valuable our victory had been. In the audience that day sat dozens of people who had survived similar attacks on their families, their resources, and their sense of security. Some had been less fortunate than I had been, lacking the preparation and support that had made my victory possible. Others had fought their own battles with different weapons and different outcomes, but all of them understood that what had happened to the Richardson family was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior that targeted vulnerable people during their most difficult moments. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her voice. Her stepfather had been attempting to gain control over her inheritance, using methods that were nearly identical to Victoria's approach, and my presentation had given her the knowledge and confidence she needed to fight back effectively. "You saved my family," she said simply, and I understood that my mother's protection had extended far beyond our own household, to touch the lives of strangers who would benefit from the lessons we had learned, and the strategies we had developed. That night, I called my father from my hotel room in Chicago, sharing the details of the conference and the impact our story was having on other families facing similar challenges. He had remarried the previous year, to a woman named Carol, who was a retired teacher, a grandmother, and someone whose interest in him was obviously genuine rather than calculating. Their relationship was built on companionship rather than financial opportunity, and watching their happiness had helped heal some of the emotional wounds left by Victoria's deception. "Emma," he said, "I think Mom would be pleased to know that her preparation not only saved us, but is helping other families survive the same kind of attacks. She always believed that our experiences should serve purposes larger than just our own protection." We talked for another hour, about business and family, and the charitable foundation we were establishing to provide legal support for families facing inheritance fraud. The conversation was easy and natural, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared understanding that had been strengthened rather than weakened by our experience with Victoria's manipulation. When I finally hung up the phone and prepared for sleep, I thought about the difference between justice and revenge, between protection and retaliation. Victoria was serving her prison sentence, learning whatever lessons were possible for someone whose entire adult life had been built on exploiting other people's trust and vulnerability. I felt no satisfaction in her punishment, only relief that she could no longer threaten my family or anyone else's. The real victory wasn't her defeat, it was the preservation of everything she had tried to destroy. My relationship with my father, stronger than ever, my understanding of my own capabilities, expanded far beyond what I had believed possible. My appreciation for my mother's wisdom and foresight, deeper and more grateful with each passing year. And perhaps most importantly, my commitment to using the Richardson family resources and influence to protect other families from the kind of sophisticated predatory behavior that had nearly destroyed us. Victoria had underestimated the wrong family. She had targeted people she assumed were weak, naive, and easily manipulated. Instead, she had encountered a multi-generational legacy of strategic thinking, careful preparation, and quiet strength that had been building defenses against people exactly like her for decades. The Richardson women, it turned out, were significantly more dangerous than anyone realized, and we intended to keep it that way. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.